Hey guys, welcome to NetFindz. Today we're going to talk about why you should probably give airbrushing a try. So for some background, I've known about airbrushing for a while, and I pretty much always thought it was a very niche kind of hobby, the sort of thing only people with specific interests would be able to benefit from, like hobby model makers and people who sell painted t-shirts in the mall, stuff like that. But I've still always been interested in it as it just seemed like a really cool way to paint. So when I got the opportunity to try it, by getting my hands on a cheap airbrushing kit to review for Amazon, I jumped on it. And now after trying it, I've learned that I really couldn't have been more wrong. So let's take a look at airbrushing and why you should probably give it a shot if you haven't already. So first off, there's this perception about airbrushing that getting into it is going to be difficult, that it's complicated, that it's probably not worth the time, and frankly, none of that is actually true. The reality is it can be extremely simple to get started. There are tons of benefits, which I'll discuss, and I'll also share some tips to getting off on the right foot because in my opinion, a little bit of knowledge really goes a long way here when it comes to making it an affordable, easy, and super useful way to paint. So what is airbrushing exactly? Google's AI defines it as a technique used to apply paint or other medium to create a smooth, even surface useful for painting, photography, and makeup. So that's a start, but for our purposes, we're mainly referring to airbrushing using small compressors and handheld airbrushes like the ones shown here and here. And also, for full disclosure, the items I'm showing today are review samples that were sent to me a while back for the purposes of writing written reviews for products like these. And that said, this video isn't a review of these products, it's just about airbrushing, but I will go ahead and provide affiliate links for anything I show down in the description below, so that if you want to pick up the same item, you've got a convenient way to do that, while also helping to support the channel. So I think this is going to be really useful for anyone who at least occasionally finds themselves painting, whatever it may be. Perhaps you're a do-it-yourselfer or make furniture or finished electronics. Maybe you do makeup or automotive customizations. Even if you're already a skilled artist with a different painting medium, I'd still recommend checking airbrushing out as it may be that thing that gives your work a little something extra. But whatever it is you might paint that is size-wise up to like a full piece of furniture, this is for you. That said, if you want to paint larger items like the walls of a house or a full car quickly, then probably you should check out like airbrushing's bigger brother, which might be like an airless paint system or an HVLP. That stands for high velocity, low pressure spray gun system, or just like a good old fashioned commercial compressor. And that's all basically just like what we're talking about today, but everything's on a larger scale. So as far as benefits that airbrushing has over like a paintbrush, say, generally it tends to give a very distinctive look which is super smooth, even, and diffuse, and especially for those of us who are not skilled artists like myself, it lets us do that in a relatively easy and quick way, which I know at least personally I wouldn't be able to do with more manual tools at all, and it's actually extremely affordable. So you might be surprised by that last one. You might think affordable, really? Well, yeah, it is actually. I was just as shocked as you might be to find out that airbrushing can be really cheap to get into. And I would say it's probably one of the most affordable ways to paint if you're going to paint more than once. It depends on the products you buy and the methods you use. Like, for example, you could go out and immediately drop $1,000 on airbrushing gear. And if you do that, you basically just throw away the whole affordability factor, just toss it right out the window. But on the other hand, you could get started airbrushing for as little as like 30 bucks and have a very versatile system that you could use to paint any color imaginable, basically as long as you wish. And the paint would cost you as little as like 25 cents to get basically the same amount of coverage as a can of spray paint would get you. So that's a major benefit right there. If you don't like spending 5 to 10 bucks or even more per can of spray paint, you should be thrilled to know that you can invest like 30 bucks up front and then pay a quarter every time you need a can of spray paint. And you also can use your airbrushing system indoors without really having to worry about tons of overspray getting on your walls and your carpet or whatever. or gassing yourself every time you do it, because another benefit of airbrushing is that you can get the same sort of results you would from a can of spray paint with very little mess and not a lot of paint or fumes floating around in the air. You basically have complete control over your paint output and volume, as well as your direction and how fine or how wide of a spray pattern you want. So all those benefits apply basically immediately. So long as you have a reasonable level of finger control and hand-eye coordination, it should be pretty easy for you to get working. So check the description below. I'm actually going to put together a couple of different lists of items to get started based around different budgets, from like bare minimum basic, you want to spend 30 bucks budget, up to like mildly expensive, and another list for things that are just good to have and make the whole process like a million times easier and more repeatable and precise. But in terms of what you need to get started, at a minimum, you need an airbrush and a compressor. So let's briefly break down airbrush and compressor kits, and I'm going to give you my suggestions there. For starters, consider what kind of items you want to paint. If you're doing general fill work, not looking to get into very fine details, or if you just want to try airbrushing out without committing, then I recommend this very simple budget option, which is a handheld version that comes with the compressor and the airbrush. These are super affordable. This is going to be your $20 to $80 budget option, and they sometimes get a bad reputation in airbrushing communities, but honestly, I've tried several of these very cheap options that were like brandless versions from China, and I've consistently been impressed. For general fill work, they're great, super easy to set up, super easy to use and maintain. They usually just lack a couple of features that you get on my next suggestion, which would be a larger kit like the one shown here. And these generally range from like $100 to $250, and mainly the advantage they give you over the handheld version is that they usually come with a dual stage airbrush, which means the trigger of the brush can control airflow and paint supply separately. Airflow generally by pressing down, and paint release by pulling backwards on the trigger. Most of the handheld versions do not come with this, which brings us to today's first sponsor. Check out the GOCHEER brand airbrushing kit shown here, available on Amazon. They have a couple of kits starting at $59.99, currently on sale from $79.99. And these particular kits come with a compact air compressor, hose, and airbrush, as well as a couple of different needle sizes and some paint cups and tools for cleaning and maintenance. And again, kits like this are a great way to start out on a limited budget and be able to achieve some fine detail work. These ones are currently rated 4 out of 5 stars and tout a dual action airbrush design, so be sure to check out the links down in the description below if you want to pick up a kit like this one. These larger versions also plug into the wall, so they won't limit your painting time by battery life, and they tend to have more precise and varied control over your air pressure, which can be important for dialing in exactly what your brush stroke is going to look like, whether you want a wide spray pattern or like a thin line. And lastly, I will just briefly point out that if you're primarily interested in airbrushing to create fine artwork, there are some brands that are highly recommended for being very versatile and probably in your particular case worth investing the extra money into. And the easiest recommendation here tends to be the Iwata Eclipse HPCS brush. Posh as well as Harder and Steenbeck also come in highly recommended for this type of airbrush. Also, I would still recommend that you save your money on the air compressor and just look for something that comes highly reviewed and includes a tank and some cooling fans if you intend to paint for many long sessions frequently. But again, for the vast majority of people, this is probably not going to be the best expenditure of your budget. Now that you've got your airbrush and compressor sorted out, you also need some paint, and I'm going to suggest unequivocally for this that you hit up your local grocery store arts and crafts section. I personally shop at Walmart regularly, and they have these water-based acrylics for as low as like 58 cents a bottle, and they work marvelously. You could also go to an arts and crafts store or purchase paint online, and you can pay more for higher quality paint, but the 58 cents per bottle stuff works really well for most use cases. And the only other thing I'm really going to say about paint is that you should be aware, depending on the surface you're trying to paint on, you still may need to do some prep work to get good adhesion, which could be just like sanding the surface or in some cases you might need a certain type of primer, and that's going to apply to any sort of painting you do, not just airbrushing, so that just kind of comes with the territory. The next thing you're going to need is products to thin the paint, which could be as simple as just plain water. But if you want a better experience than just using water, I would recommend a bottle of isopropyl alcohol and a bottle of vegetable glycerin. Essentially, you can use these two items along with water to create a do-it-yourself version of airbrush paint thinner very cheaply. If budget is of less concern to you, then you could just buy a bottle of airbrush paint thinner, but that stuff isn't cheap, so I highly advise the DIY way, which I'll break down later in the video. You'll also need a surface to paint on, which absolutely could just be a cardboard box that you place your item into, but if you want to be more fancy and efficient, you could also pick up something like a desktop spray booth that provides you with lighting and sucks up extra paint in the air and filters it and blows the exhaust out your window. And yes, they do actually sell this kind of thing on Amazon, and your choice there should really depend on your budget and what you're trying to accomplish. For most cases, the cardboard box is more than adequate, and you probably already have one laying around. Okay, so that's mostly everything you absolutely need, but I do still have some suggestions to make the airbrushing process as a whole much smoother, easier, and more repeatable. I recommend the following tools for mixing and storing paint as well as cleanup. A glass graduated mixing cup like this one. Definitely go with glass as it's much easier to clean, and the graduations will help you to get familiar with making repeatable batches of paint. Also highly advise a set of these glass graduated squeeze syringes. These are super useful to be able to measure out a specific ratio of paint to paint thinner materials or different colors of paint in the case that you want to mix up a custom color. I also really like this little mixing tool, marketed for tattoo ink, but it also works perfectly for our purposes. This just makes mixing the paint significantly faster and more thorough. I also really like to use these glass dropper vial storage bottles to save a batch of paint for future use. Just be sure that if you go with these, you get a quality one, as they don't all seal equally well, and that's super important to prevent your paint drying out. I like to use a label maker to mark my paint vials with the color and the precise mix of components, so that if I use one of these paints and need more, I can easily create the same color and consistency. Also great to have is one of these airbrush cleaning picks. This helps a lot if you get a clog in the nozzle of your brush, and these little pipe cleaners often these come included with an airbrush kit, like even the cheap ones. But they just help in general when you're cleaning your brush. You should also have some paper towels or rags for general cleanup, and also to help get your paint cup clean between switching colors. And the last thing I'm going to mention is going to be safety gear. Personally, I would recommend that even though airbrushing generally doesn't have nearly the same kind of volume of paint particles floating around compared to something like spray painting, still a great idea and generally advisable to wear a respirator, just for peace of mind if nothing else. It's also nice to have like safety glasses to prevent paint particles going into your eyes or getting on your glasses if you wear glasses like I do. And a pair of gloves, I would say, if you really don't want paint on your hands, but generally I don't really sweat that one. And that's going to lead us to our second sponsor of the day, which is NILTECH brand on Amazon. They currently have an all-in-one artist pen set for journaling, drawing, and more. And items like this are a great way to complement your airbrushing if you're just getting into it and want a variety of different options for situations where an airbrush isn't the perfect tool for the job. For $27.80 currently on Amazon, this set of pens and brush markers is rated 4.5 out of 5 stars and gives you 16 dual tip brush pens, 3 calligraphy pens, 10 drawing pens, a ruler, a white ink pen, and a mechanical pencil, as well as a sketch pad, which is a lot of options to get started. So be sure to check out the link in the description below for that as well. And just to give you an idea of the kind of mess or safety hazards we're talking about, if you've ever sprayed a can of spray paint indoors with like a window open and maybe even a simple paper sort of face mask on, and afterwards gone to look in the mirror and noticed that your nostrils were like totally black or whatever color you were spray painting, just from the sheer volume of paint that you inhaled during that session. And this has totally happened to me. Compared to that, I would say even if I were to airbrush for like the rest of my life indoors with no ventilation and no mask, I'd probably never inhale that same volume of paint from doing so. Really, it's just a vastly different amount of overspray. Uh, of course, better safe than sorry. Always wear your safety gear. Just sleep easy knowing that the risks are a lot lower with airbrushing compared to like, typical can of spray paint sort of deal. Once you have your gear, it's surprisingly easy to get going. The most difficult part is going to be mixing your paint, but we'll get to that. To begin with, you need to connect your compressor and your airbrush, and exactly how you do that may vary a little bit depending on what you bought. For these smaller compressor brush combos, generally the brush thread uh, is going to be connecting directly onto the little handheld compressor. And once the two are connected, you just push a button to turn it on, and if you have a cup with paint attached, you're ready to go. This is an airbrush cup, and it usually just sits on top of the airbrush, and gravity draws the paint down into the body of the brush where it gets sprayed out the nozzle. But there are some other designs, like ones which sit below the brush and use air pressure to suck paint up into the line of air spraying out. If you got a kit with one of these larger style compressors, it probably came with a hose to connect your airbrush. If not, generally the hose is just an air hose with a 1/8 inch BSP, that's British Standard Pipe fitting, on both ends. One side threads onto your compressor outlet and the other side threads onto the bottom of your brush, and again, you're good to go. Next, you've got to get your paint ready, because by default, those little 58 cents of watercolor acrylics are not going to be the right consistency to spray out of an airbrush. So you've got to get the color you want mixed if it's not just a regular color, and you've got to thin that paint down so that it can spray out efficiently and not clog your airbrush up. So start by choosing the color you want, and have a cup or something that you can mix in and measure out as much of that water-based acrylic paint as you think you'll need, and just estimate here. And remember that we're going to thin this down by at least half of its current consistency. Probably more like 2 times its current consistency, really. So keep that in mind when measuring your paint out. Next, I like to add in about the same quantity of water as I added in paint. So if I used my graduated dropper to put in 15 milliliters of paint, I'll use another clean graduated dropper to add in 15 milliliters of water. And then I like to start with about 20% of that water volume as isopropyl alcohol, and I use 91% isopropyl. So if I put 15 milliliters of water into 15 milliliters of paint, I would add in 3 to 4 milliliters of isopropyl, and then for that quantity I would add like 2 drops of vegetable glycerin. Proceed to mix that up super well, and then use something like either your mixer's tip or a wooden stick or a spoon or something like that to pick up some of that paint and let it drip off back into the cup. And you'll know your paint is at the right consistency when it flows off like milk. So basically imagine milk dripping off of a spoon, and that will help you to figure out if your paint is thin enough. And that's a tip that I learned from another YouTuber, and I have to say it works really well. Getting those ratios exactly right is just a matter of trial and error, and it's going to vary a bit between different paint brands and different paint colors, but I find these general ratios to be a pretty good starting point to modify off of. And once you think you've got it, put a little bit into your airbrushing cup and try to spray it. And it should spray out smoothly and evenly. If it doesn't spray out at all, you probably need to thin it out a lot more. If it sprays out like water and it doesn't stick to the surface, then you've gone overboard with thinning and you need to add a little bit more paint. Now, if you go to spray and your paint spreads out like a pool into little fingers away from the center of your circle, your paint is probably too thin, or your air pressure is too high, or you might be too close for the pressure that you're spraying at. If you want finer detailed lines, lower your pressure down. If you want a larger spray pattern, increase your pressure. If the paint looks chalky, it may be too thick. If it looks grainy, you may need to increase your pressure. So that is just a little bit of trial and error there. A little bit of practice goes a long way with that. But once you've got it right, the paint should spray out very smoothly. If you're the right distance away from the surface for the pressure you're using, you shouldn't see puddling or pooling or little drips being blown away. It should look really nice and uniform. And you can use your your finger to adjust the paint volume or the air volume and the paint volume if you got that dual action airbrush that I mentioned earlier in the video. Now also, if say your brush won't do as large of a spray pattern as you want, or it won't do as fine of a line as you want, no matter how little air pressure and little paint you release, then what you might need to do is try and replace the needle inside your brush. Brushes generally come with different diameter needles, and on some brushes you can swap out the needle and the nozzle together, and you can change the minimum and maximum sizes of your spray pattern by doing that. And that's also something you'll want to consider when you go to buy your airbrush. If you are just looking to do general color fill-in work, then you may want to aim for something with a larger diameter needle, like a 0.5 millimeter. Whereas if you intend to be painting lots of tiny details, I think they make needles that go down as low as like 0.1 millimeter, or maybe even slightly smaller than that. So take that into consideration when you're shopping. And if you're painting and you want to change colors, what most people advise is to use a little bottle like this to run some water and possibly some isopropyl or airbrush cleaner through your brush until it sprays out clear, and then go ahead and add in your pre-mixed paint to change color. You can also do a less thorough job of cleaning out your cup before adding in the new color if you want some blending between two different hues. And as far as cleanup goes, once you're done painting all together and it's time to clean up, for that process, I personally disassemble my brush every time and clean every component thoroughly in water, and then I run a few cups of airbrush cleaner or water and isopropyl alcohol through the airbrush and spray that out to make sure it's totally cleaned out. And I look for any stuck paint around the nozzle cup and all the little parts, and I get those off with just like a damp cloth or one of these little pipe cleaning brushes. Also can help out in that process. And especially if there's like a stubborn bit of paint or something that doesn't easily want to break free. But I'm extremely careful during this process. One, to not bend my airbrush needle. So like never ever touch the tip of the needle to anything hard, as it's very easy to break or deform that needle. And two, watch out for all the small parts, as many airbrushes contain like little tiny O-rings and things like that, which can go missing quite easily if you're not careful. So it's best to go ahead and get familiar with the assembly and disassembly of your airbrush before you use it for the first time, so that you know what to expect when you go to clean it. But that's just my process, and most people don't recommend doing that. Most people kind of just use that method that I mentioned when changing colors to clean out their airbrush. They just add in water or airbrush cleaner to the cup, spray that out until it comes out clear, and when there's no more color left, they consider that clean. And then maybe additionally also do what's called like a back pressure to remove any stuck paint from inside the nozzle. And the way you do that is you cover up the tip of your nozzle with like a cloth and spray into that cloth while your cup is full of airbrush cleaner or water and isopropyl. And you should see bubbles you should see bubbles go back into your airbrush cup, and that just helps free up stuck paint inside the internal parts of the brush, and then you can continue to spray out until there's no more color left, and that's really all there is to it. Just be sure that if you go with my method where you're going to disassemble the brush to do a cleaning on it, just make sure not to lose or damage anything or put any undue stress on the parts, as you know, some of these parts are really delicate, and every time you disassemble them you add a little bit of wear and tear to them. Now if you're careful, I don't think you'll have any issues doing that. I personally haven't had any issues. I'm just super careful every time I do it, and I end up feeling like my brush is, you know, totally clean. I get rid of every little bit of paint, and that's the way I like to do things. But you don't have to. So that is going to wrap up this video, guys. If you appreciated the content, feel free to leave me a like, write me a comment, or subscribe to my channel. All of that's definitely appreciated. And remember, if you want to pick up any of the items shown in this video, definitely consider using the link down in the description below, as that will be a great way to support us as well. So thanks again for watching. I hope you guys learned something in this video and that you have a great time airbrushing, and see you in the next video.